A grieving mother finds her son's hidden diary, only to uncover a secret so devastating that it shatters everything she believed. But just as the truth begins to surface, she realizes someone will do anything to keep it buried. Ethan Carter parked his car in the driveway, letting out a deep sigh before stepping out. The house before him stood eerily quiet, just as he had left it that morning. A beautiful yet melancholic structure in the suburbs of Chicago, the place had once been full of laughter and life. Now it was a prison of memories, frozen in time since that tragic day. He opened the front door, the familiar scent of lavender and old wood welcoming him like a ghost of the past. Claire, his wife, sat in her usual spot by the window, her thin frame bathed in the golden hues of the fading sunlight. She didn't turn to look at him. She never did. "Hey, Claire," he murmured, placing his keys on the table. No response, no movement, just the same distant gaze fixed outside, as if she were searching for something beyond his understanding. Ethan had gotten used to this silence. It was a silence filled with unspoken pain, with unanswered questions. It had been 3 years since their son, Oliver, had died. And in those 3 years, Claire had barely spoken a word, dragging a hand down his face. He moved into the kitchen to prepare dinner. It was a mindless routine now, one plate of food untouched, the other barely eaten. He knew what would happen. He'd set the plate down beside her, she wouldn't acknowledge it, and he'd sit at the other end of the table, eating in solitude. Tonight was no different. Halfway through his meal, his phone buzzed. A message from the shelter. "She's waiting for you." Ethan swallowed hard, staring at the words for a moment before pushing his chair back. He had agreed to take in a temporary foster child, something he had debated over for weeks. Could he bring a child into this house? Could he balance caring for Claire while helping a little girl in need? He didn't have the answers, but the alternative, leaving Sophie in the system, was something he couldn't live with. Grabbing his coat, he approached Claire, crouching beside her chair. "I have to step out for a bit. I'll be back soon." No response. He didn't expect one. The shelter wasn't far. The moment he stepped inside, the cool fluorescent lighting made everything feel more sterile than it probably was. A woman at the front desk recognized him immediately and gave him a sympathetic smile. "She's been quiet," she said, leading him to the back. "But she's smart. Observant." Sophie Miller sat on a worn-out couch, her small frame curled up, hands gripping the edges of a backpack as if it were her last possession in the world. She looked up as he approached, her dark eyes wary but not fearful. "Hey, Sophie," Ethan said gently, crouching to her level. "I'm Ethan. It's nice to meet you." She studied him for a moment before nodding. No words, just a nod. The silence was something he understood. The woman handed him a few papers to sign, going over the basics. Sophie was 8, had been bouncing between shelters, no known relatives. Another lost child in a system that barely held together. Once everything was in order, he turned to Sophie. "Ready to go?" She hesitated, then gave another small nod. The car ride home was quiet. Sophie stared out the window, watching the city lights blur past. Ethan stole glances at her in the rearview mirror, noting how small she looked, how tightly she clutched her backpack. He didn't push her to talk. He knew the weight of words unspoken. When they arrived, Sophie hesitated at the doorway. "This is your home now," Ethan said, hoping the words would bring her comfort. She stepped inside cautiously, her gaze darting around, taking in the dimly lit space. Claire remained by the window, unaware of their arrival, or perhaps just indifferent to it. Sophie didn't move past the threshold of the living room. She simply stood there, staring at Claire with an expression Ethan couldn't quite place. Ethan set her small bag down by the stairs. "You must be tired. I'll show you to your room." Sophie finally looked at him, then back at Claire before nodding once more. As Ethan led her upstairs, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in the air. A strange, unspoken energy seemed to settle over the house, as if the presence of this little girl had stirred something long dormant. He glanced back at Claire one last time before ascending the stairs, unaware that the stillness in the room was about to change forever. The house was quiet the next morning, except for the soft creaks of the wooden floorboards as Sophie tiptoed through the hallway. Ethan had told her she could explore, that this was her home now, but the weight of unfamiliarity kept her steps cautious. She passed by Claire, who remained in the same spot by the window, unmoving, her eyes lost in some distant thought. Sophie's small hands traced the walls as she walked, feeling the texture of the peeling wallpaper. Everything about the house felt frozen in time, like a place once full of warmth that had been left untouched for too long. She stopped in front of a closed door. Something about it made her hesitate. It was different from the others. The dust settled thickly at its base, untouched. Slowly, she reached out, turning the knob. The door creaked open. Inside, the air smelled of dust and something faintly familiar, something like old books and forgotten memories. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across a neatly made bed. Sophie stepped inside, glancing around at the shelves lined with children's books, the small desk covered in untouched papers, and a dresser with picture frames turned face down. It was a child's room. Sophie didn't know whose, but something in her gut told her that no one had entered this space for a long time. Her eyes fell on the floor near the bed, where a small, loose wooden board stuck out from the rest. She knelt down, fingers prying at the edge, and after a moment, it lifted with a quiet groan. Beneath it, nestled in the hollow space, was an old leather-bound book. Diary. She ran her fingers over the cover, the worn texture making her shiver. Carefully, she lifted it out of its hiding place, brushing away the thin layer of dust. The spine cracked slightly as she opened it, revealing the first page. The name written there sent a chill down her spine. Oliver Carter. Sophie's breath hitched. She didn't know who Oliver was, but she knew that name belonged to something important, something lost. A rustling sound made her snap the book shut. She turned quickly, expecting to see Ethan, but instead Claire stood at the door, her wide, vacant eyes locked onto the diary in Sophie's hands. And for the first time since Sophie arrived, Claire moved. Sophie's fingers tightened around the diary as Claire took a slow, unsteady step forward. The woman's gaze, usually vacant and lifeless, was locked onto the old leather book as if it held something she had long forgotten. Ethan had told Sophie that Claire rarely reacted to anything, but now, standing in the doorway, Claire's entire body seemed to tremble with something unfamiliar. Recognition. Sophie hesitated, then extended the diary toward her. The air between them felt fragile, like the moment could shatter if either of them made the wrong move. Claire's hands, pale and delicate, lifted with hesitation before she took the book. The moment her fingers brushed the worn leather, she inhaled sharply. Her breath hitched, and for the first time in 3 years she made a sound, an almost imperceptible gasp. Sophie stepped back, watching as Claire's lips parted, mouthing something too faint to hear. Her fingers traced the name on the cover. Oliver Carter. Downstairs, Ethan called out. The sound jolted Claire from whatever trance she had been in. She clutched the diary to her chest and turned sharply, stepping out of the room before Sophie could react. Sophie hesitated for only a moment before hurrying after her. By the time she reached the staircase, Claire was already at the bottom, moving with a determination that seemed unnatural compared to her usual stillness. Sophie hesitated at the top of the stairs, torn between calling out for Ethan or following Claire into the living room. He chose the latter. Claire had returned to her chair by the window, but this time she wasn't staring blankly outside. She had opened the diary and was flipping through the pages with trembling hands. The silence stretched, thick with something unspoken. Then a whisper. Soft, almost inaudible, but there. Sophie's breath caught. She stepped closer, heart pounding. "What did you say?" Claire's lips moved again, her voice a ghost of what it once was. "Oliver." Sophie barely had time to process what she had heard before Ethan appeared in the doorway. His expression one of exhaustion. "Sophie, He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes widening as he saw Claire clutching the diary, her lips moving ever so slightly. "Claire." His voice was barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would scare her back into silence. Claire didn't look up. She turned a page, staring at the words written there, her shoulders rising and falling unevenly. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, her whispering ceased. She closed the diary with a shaking breath, pressing it against her lap as if trying to absorb something from it. Ethan took a step forward, his eyes full of emotions he hadn't let himself feel in years. "Claire, what is it?" But she didn't respond. Whatever fleeting moment had surfaced was slipping away, leaving only silence in its wake. Yet Sophie knew something had changed, and it had all started with the diary. Ethan sat across from Claire, his hands clenched together, struggling to steady his breath. He had spent years accepting her silence, adapting to a life where she was present but unreachable. But now, she was gripping Oliver's diary as if it were the only thing tethering her to reality. "Claire," he tried again, his voice softer this time. "What's in the diary?" Claire's fingers pressed against the leather cover, her nails faintly digging into it. Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she looked down, as if the weight of the pages had suddenly become too much to bear. Sophie shifted beside Ethan, her small frame rigid with tension. She wasn't sure if she should say something, but instinct told her to wait. She had seen things unravel before, people breaking open like fragile objects when pushed too hard. Claire's hands trembled as she opened the diary again. She flipped through the pages with an urgency that unsettled Ethan. He wanted to take the book from her, to see what had shaken her so deeply, but he didn't. He needed her to come to him on her own. Finally, her breath hitched, and she landed on a page somewhere in the middle. She traced a few words with her fingertips, her eyes darting back and forth as if confirming something that only she understood. Then she whispered, "It wasn't an accident." Ethan felt the air rush out of his lungs. His body tensed as his mind scrambled to process the words. He had told himself so many times that Oliver's death was just that, an accident. A tragic, senseless accident. But the way Claire said it, Sophie's eyes widened, her fingers curling into the fabric of her sweater. She wanted to ask, but the look on Ethan's face kept her silent. "What do you mean?" Ethan's voice was barely above a whisper. Claire blinked rapidly, as if realizing the weight of what she had just said. She closed the diary abruptly, holding it against her chest like a shield. Her breathing grew shallow, panic flickering in her expression. Ethan leaned forward, his heart pounding. "Claire, please." "I can't," she interrupted, shaking her head. "Not yet." She rose from the chair abruptly, the movement startling Sophie. Without another word, she clutched the diary tightly and left the room, her steps uneven, unsteady. Ethan sat there, staring at the empty space she had left behind. His mind reeled, his pulse thundered in his ears. Not an accident. He turned to Sophie, whose face was pale. She didn't have to say anything. He knew she had felt it too. Something was unraveling. Something bigger than either of them had expected. And it had only just begun. Ethan barely slept that night. The words Claire had whispered, "It wasn't an accident," echoed through his mind, unraveling everything he had convinced himself to believe. He lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint creaks of the house settling. Somewhere down the hall, Claire was awake too. He could hear the soft rustling of pages turning, the occasional uneven breath. She was reading the diary, again and again. When morning came, Ethan found Claire in the kitchen, sitting at the small table with the diary open in front of her. Her fingers traced the words, but her eyes looked distant, lost somewhere between the past and the present. Sophie sat on the opposite side, watching her with quiet curiosity. She hadn't spoken much since the night before, but Ethan could see it in her face. She felt it too. The air in the house had changed. It was heavier, charged with something unsaid. Ethan poured himself a cup of coffee, his movements slow, deliberate. He took a deep breath before sitting down across from Claire. Claire, he said gently, tell me what you remember. She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edges of the diary. For a long moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. But then her lips parted. It was the afternoon, she whispered. Her voice was hoarse, as if it had forgotten how to carry weight. Oliver was playing outside. Ethan held his breath. He remembered that day all too well. How sunny it had been, how the world had seemed so normal, right up until it wasn't. Claire's hands trembled as she continued. I was inside folding laundry. I heard him laugh. And then, her voice caught. She swallowed hard. Then nothing. Sophie shifted in her chair, gripping the edge of the table. I ran outside, Claire said, her voice barely more than a breath. And he was gone. Ethan clenched his jaw. He had heard this part before. The way Claire had run through the backyard, screaming Oliver's name. The way the world had stopped when they finally found him near the water's edge. But Claire wasn't done. She turned the diary toward Ethan, her finger pressing against a paragraph. This, she said, her voice trembling. I didn't write this. Ethan frowned. He leaned in, scanning the familiar handwriting. Oliver's handwriting. The words sent a chill through him. Mommy doesn't want me to tell. His stomach twisted. He looked at Claire, his pulse hammering in his ears. Tell what? Claire shook her head. I don't know. I don't remember. Sophie, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. Her voice was small but steady. Maybe you weren't supposed to. Claire looked at her, startled. Sophie's dark eyes met hers, unblinking. Ethan exhaled, rubbing his hands over his face. He didn't know what scared him more. The possibility that Claire had forgotten something crucial, or the possibility that someone had wanted her to forget. Either way, the past was no longer buried. And they were just beginning to unearth it. Claire stared at the words in Oliver's handwriting, her breath coming in uneven gasps. Mommy doesn't want me to tell. The phrase looped in her mind, a thread leading back to something she couldn't grasp. Something lost in the shadows of her memory. Ethan reached across the table, covering her trembling hand with his own. Claire, take your time, he said softly. Do you remember anything else? She shook her head, eyes filling with frustration. It's like there's something there, but I can't reach it. I don't know what he meant. I don't know why he wrote that. Silence filled the kitchen, thick and suffocating. Then a small voice cut through it. Sophie, the girl murmured. Both Ethan and Claire turned to her. Sophie's fingers traced the edge of the diary, her brow furrowed in thought. He wrote my name. Ethan's breath caught. What? Claire's expression turned to pure confusion. What do you mean? Sophie hesitated, then pointed at a later page in the diary. Ethan pulled the book closer, scanning the scribbled words. And there it was, written in Oliver's shaky, childlike handwriting. Her name is Sophie. The room seemed to shrink around them. The name stared back at Ethan like a puzzle piece that had been missing all along. He looked at Sophie, at the way she was gripping the table, her knuckles turning white. You don't remember anything about Oliver, do you? Ethan asked, his voice careful. Sophie shook her head. No, I don't think so. But Ethan wasn't sure. Something about her hesitation, the way her gaze flickered, told him she wasn't certain either. Claire, still frozen in place, whispered, "Why would he write her name?" No one had the answer. But deep down, Ethan felt something shift. As if they had just stepped into something far bigger than they had imagined. Something neither of them were ready for. Ethan ran a hand over his face, his pulse pounding in his ears. Her name is Sophie. The words felt like a lock clicking into place, but the door they led to remained shrouded in darkness. Claire sat stiffly, her fingers still gripping the edges of the diary as if afraid it might disappear. Oliver never mentioned a Sophie to me, she murmured. Not once. Sophie shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her small hands curling into fists. I don't remember him either, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But maybe I should." Ethan exchanged a glance with Claire, both of them feeling the weight of something they couldn't yet name. He reached for the diary again, flipping through the pages with growing urgency. Then he stopped. There, scrawled messily near the back, was another phrase in Oliver's uneven handwriting. "I think she's my sister." The room went cold. Claire let out a sharp breath, recoiling as if the words had burned her. Ethan's grip on the book tightened. His thoughts raced, searching for an explanation, but none made sense. "Sophie." Ethan hesitated. "Do you know anything about your family?" She shook her head slowly. "I don't remember them. I've always been in the system. They told me my mom left. But I don't know who she was." Claire pressed a hand to her forehead, her breathing uneven. "This doesn't make sense. How could Oliver think that? How could he have known about Sophie?" Ethan's stomach twisted. There was only one way to find out. "We need to dig deeper," he said, his voice low. "If Oliver wrote this, then he knew something. And if he knew, then someone else did too." Claire met his gaze, her blue eyes reflecting both fear and something else. Determination. For the first time in years, she wasn't shrinking away from the past. Sophie, still quiet, looked down at the diary. She traced the ink with her fingertip as if hoping the words would reveal something more. Something buried deep inside her own memories. Ethan exhaled slowly. Whatever secrets had been kept from them were beginning to surface. And the truth, however painful, was no longer content to stay forgotten. Ethan paced the living room, the diary still clutched in his hands. The revelation that Oliver believed Sophie was his sister had shaken him. But it wasn't enough. They needed answers, and there was only one person who might have them. Dr. Alan Price. Claire sat on the couch, her expression tight. She hadn't spoken much since the discovery, but her silence wasn't empty this time. It was thoughtful, measured. She was processing, and that, at least, was progress. "I'll go see him," Ethan finally said, exhaling sharply. "He was your therapist, Claire. If anyone knows something about your missing memories, it's him." Claire hesitated before nodding. "He won't tell you anything easily," she warned. "He always kept things locked away. Even from me." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Then I'll make him talk." Dr. Price's office was in an old brick building downtown, its sterile walls lined with diplomas and shelves filled with neatly arranged books. The place smelled of leather and faintly of disinfectant. The doctor himself was the same as Ethan remembered, tall, composed, and unervingly calm. His gray hair was neatly combed back, his sharp blue eyes assessing as he gestured for Ethan to sit. "To what do I owe the visit, Mr. Carter?" Price asked smoothly, folding his hands over his desk. Ethan didn't waste time. He placed Oliver's diary on the table, tapping his finger on the page with Sophie's name. "Explain this." Price arched an eyebrow but didn't touch the book. "I'm not sure I understand what you expect me to explain." Ethan leaned forward. "Claire's memories are missing pieces. Oliver wrote about Sophie. He thought she was his sister. What do you know about that?" The doctor didn't react immediately. Instead, he studied Ethan carefully, as if weighing how much to say. Then finally he sighed. "I always knew this would come back," he murmured almost to himself. Ethan's heartbeat quickened. "Come back." Price finally looked at him. "There are things better left in the past, Mr. Carter. Digging them up won't bring you peace." Ethan clenched his fists. "That's not your choice to make." Dr. Price exhaled, then slowly leaned back in his chair. "Fine," he said. "But understand this. Once you start pulling at threads, the entire fabric unravels." Ethan's eyes darkened. "Then let it unravel." Ethan sat frozen, Dr. Price's words hanging in the air like a warning. Once you start pulling at threads, the entire fabric unravels. But he wasn't about to stop now. Not when they were so close to understanding what really happened to Oliver. Dr. Price watched him carefully before speaking again. Claire came to me after the accident, but it wasn't just grief that silenced her, Ethan. It was fear. Ethan's stomach twisted. Fear of what? The doctor exhaled, choosing his words carefully. Of what she might remember. Ethan gritted his teeth. Then help me. Help her. Dr. Price hesitated before finally nodding. There's something I never told you. After Oliver's death, Claire had brief moments of clarity, fragments of memory surfacing before she pushed them away again. She said something to me once. He paused, then looked directly into Ethan's eyes. She said I did this. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. That's not possible, he said, shaking his head. Claire would never. She didn't say it out of guilt, Price interrupted. She said it as if she knew. Ethan pushed back from the desk, his head spinning. He couldn't believe it. He wouldn't believe it. Without another word, he stormed out of the office. By the time he reached home, Claire was sitting in the living room, the diary still in her lap. Sophie sat beside her, clutching her knees, her eyes darting between them. Ethan barely managed to steady himself as he approached. Claire, he murmured, sitting down across from her. We need to talk. She looked up at him, then really looked at him for the first time in years. And in her eyes he saw it, the fear Price had spoken of. But there was something else too. Resolve. She took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the diary. Ethan, she whispered. I remember. The room went silent. Even Sophie held her breath. Claire swallowed hard. That day, Oliver wasn't alone. Ethan's pulse roared in his ears. Who was with him? Claire exhaled shakily. Me, she admitted. And Sophie's mother. Sophie flinched. Ethan felt the world tilt beneath him. She came to see me, Claire continued. To warn me. Her voice broke. But it was too late. Ethan could barely form the words. Warn you about what? Claire's lips parted, but no sound came out. Tears welled in her eyes as she finally whispered the words that would change everything. The truth about Oliver's father. Ethan felt as though the air had been sucked from the room. He stared at Claire, unable to comprehend what she had just said. The truth about Oliver's father. What do you mean? He asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Claire's hands tightened around the diary, her knuckles white. Ethan, Oliver wasn't yours. The words landed like a physical blow. Ethan stiffened, his body numb, his mind refusing to accept it. That's not possible. Claire's eyes glistened with tears. I never wanted to lie to you, she choked. But I was scared. I thought I could bury it. I thought it wouldn't matter. Ethan's heart pounded, his entire world shifting beneath him. Who? Claire swallowed hard. Dr. Price. The room fell into silence. Ethan could barely breathe. Dr. Price. The man who had guided them through their grief. The man who had held Claire's memories in his hands and let her drown in them. Sophie's small voice broke the quiet. And my mom? She asked, her eyes wide with fear. Claire turned to her slowly. She knew, she admitted. She came that day to tell me the truth. She was trying to warn me that Price. That he was dangerous. That Oliver had started asking questions. Ethan clenched his fists. That's why Oliver wrote it in his diary. Claire nodded. I think he overheard something. I think he figured out the truth before we did. Sophie let out a shaky breath. What happened to my mom? Claire shut her eyes. She left that day, she whispered. After. She stopped herself. After Oliver's accident. Ethan's stomach twisted. Are you saying she was involved? Claire shook her head quickly. No, but I think she was afraid. And I think Dr. Price made sure she disappeared. A heavy silence settled between them. The weight of the past had finally come crashing down. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. So what do we do now? Claire lifted the diary. We finish what Oliver started. Sophie blinked. You mean, expose him? Claire nodded. We go to the police. We tell them everything. Ethan hesitated, then looked at Sophie. She was staring at the diary, her small fingers tracing Oliver's handwriting. "Are you ready for this?" he asked her gently. Sophie took a deep breath. "Oliver didn't get to finish his story," she said. "But we can." Ethan felt something shift inside him. The past had tried to bury the truth, but the three of them were still here. And they weren't going to let it stay hidden any longer. He took Claire's hand, then Sophie's. "Then let's do this." The diary had once been a record of secrets. Now it would become their legacy. And the truth would finally come to light. What if everything you thought you knew about your past was a lie? What if the truth had been hidden in plain sight, waiting to be uncovered? Claire spent years trapped in silence, but when she finally opened Oliver's diary, she discovered a secret that changed everything. Now, the question remains: how far would you go to reveal the truth, even if it meant confronting the darkness you tried to forget? Click on the video on the screen to continue this journey of self-discovery and uncover the final pieces of this haunting mystery.